4th, and tonight's meeting is our strategy session. I think it's actually very, very strategic because we're getting the managers for meeting to order, and wanted to say tonight's strategy meeting is being held as a virtual meeting in accordance with electronic means, and the public and media are able to join this meeting on the government channel, the city's Facebook page, and I think for the first time having a difference with the pandemic to deal with. And so we're going to have the manager present his proposed budget in your weekly packet. Our budget public hearing will take place virtually on May 11th and May 20th at 1 p.m. virtually as well. And at this time, I'd like to have the council introduce themselves in the order provided before the meeting.
Ms. Isel.
Oh, there's the Mayor Pro Tem.
I'm sorry. I'll say it again. I'm Julie Isel. I'm Mayor Pro Tem. And hear me? Sarah? Should I say it again?
Serve the City Council at large.
Braxton Winston at large.
Good evening, Renee Johnson, District 4.
Ed Driggs, District 7.
All right, I know that we have our city clerk. Turn it over to our city manager, Marcus Jones, for the FY2021 budget presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. FY2021 budget, and shortly thereafter it's yours. So what we'll do is provide answers that will get us from July 1st of 2020 to June 30th of 2021. On page 7 of the first budget book that I presented to this council, and we discussed acute shocks and chronic stresses and chronic and acute shocks were hurricanes or tornadoes that emergency management this path years ago. It put us in a good situation to either a city manager or a budget director or someone in finance. And I'll tell you, it's the first time that I've done this sitting down, and it really shows what we're dealing with right now, something different than many of us have ever experienced. And many times we hear concepts like the new normal or the new abnormal, but as a team, we really discuss this as the new. And we leave the blank behind it because we're not exactly sure what this will look like in the future. But what we do know is that with steady leadership, and that is from the mayor and the council, and steady leadership from the administration, we know that we can get through this maybe better than any other city our size. We have a strong foundation that we call Team Charlotte, and it's not just a tagline. And I will tell you, over the course of the last couple of months, I've seen good men become better men and good women become better women, and a very, very good team become even better. So I'm proud of what we are going to produce for you today, produce together. And I use we because it really took an all hands-on effort. So let's talk a little bit about the council. 4 years ago, you started this momentum around priorities. And unlike many councils throughout the country, you've been steadfast. Well, the words may have been tweaked a little bit from time to time, but we've always considered priorities around great neighborhoods, affordable housing, safe communities, upward mobility, economic development, workforce development. And this has been a great run for the city because you've been able to create a great ecosystem. Just some of the things that have happened over the last 4 years. You've been able to attract a Fortune 100 company. You hosted an NBA All-Star game. You got the private sector to match a $50 million investment in affordable housing. You were named a Climate Challenge winner. You hosted the PGA Championship. You established an Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration. You started off by paying our lowest paid employees $15 an hour. And then last year, you bumped that up to $16 an hour. And even somewhere along the way, a lot of the things that you've done landed Charlotte an MLS team. So despite all of that momentum, and as I spoke with you, I think in this room on April the 13th, COVID-19 shifted our focus from that momentum to really an emergency management and public safety stance. The EOC has been open for over 50 days. It opened March 12th. And during that time, we've witnessed so many things, so many issues at the state, at the national and the local level that shows that this is just not unique to Charlotte. So for instance, some of the national highlights, so unemployment is estimated to be at between 15 to 20%, compared to 25% during the Great Depression. Over 30 million Americans have filed for unemployment the last 6 weeks. The U.S. created 22 million jobs since the Great Recession. So a decade's worth of job creation was eliminated in about a month. At the state level, unemployment has increased to 11.5%. At the local level, we're seeing similar numbers. But one thing I do want to tell you is that we're starting to get some revenue numbers in, and I could only suggest that these are shocking. So for instance, occupancy tax, year over year for March, down 70%. Food and beverage, year over year for March, down 56%. Vehicle rental, down 97%. The You Drive It, down 98%. Pending home sales dropped 45.5%. New residential listings fell 31%. So what we're seeing is the impact of COVID-19, and that's just for March. So what's important for us is what do we have in place as a city so that we can rebound, and also we're able to provide core services to our residents. So I just want to go back to a slide that I showed you on the 13th of April, which talked a bit about the impact of some of these taxes. So sales tax takes a hit both to the general fund and our general capital, and that's a high impact. And the same thing with the transit fund. On the hospitality side, we have occupancy tax and food and beverage tax, which also has a very high hit. So as we go through this, it's not just the general fund or our general capital, but also what's happening for some other entities that are heavily dependent on some of these tax revenues. Also, last month, I talked a bit about the federal funding for state and local governments. And as a matter of fact, our CFO, Kelly Flannery, went through some of these pots of money. So I just want to give you a quick update about the impact here for Charlotte. You may recall that CATS has received $56.9 million from the federal government, and that can help mitigate revenue declines. Same thing with aviation, $135 million, which can also mitigate revenue declines. On April the 13th, you approved $5.7 million of CDBG, ESG, and HUPWA funds to help with housing, and to also, you approved another $1 million for grants for businesses, small businesses in our corridor areas. So it's important to know that there are some federal funds that are coming in that have an impact on the city. There's also the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which has $155 million that is also available to the city. That, as we talked last month, that deals with cities with a population of 500,000 or more. So that's a small segment of all the cities in the country. So in other words, some states don't have cities with populations of 500,000 or more, and therefore could not access these funds. I would tell you that there are some keys around these funds. One is that they're for costs that are incurred due to COVID-19. They cannot be used for anything that was already accounted for in the budget. They are related to expenditures over the period of March 1st, 2020 to December 30th, 2020. And unlike CATS in aviation, they cannot be used to replace revenue. So what we're doing as a team is analyzing how we can utilize those funds to help us, especially in the area of critical operations and infrastructure. It's clear in the guidance that these funds can be used for medical, public health, payroll, or COVID-19 compliance, but they also can be used for investments in economic support. So one of the things that I present to you tonight is an opportunity for us over the course of the next 30 days to see what's happening across the country for these 37 or so cities that have this access to the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and how those are being used, one, to help with delivery of critical services. So for instance, how can we make sure that our buses are safe for people to ride in them? How can we make sure that our buildings are appropriate for the general public to come back into? And we will provide you with additional information about the use of those funds and how they're being used across the country. In terms of our two big enterprise funds, CATS and aviation, they remain financially strong. As I mentioned earlier, they are receiving federal assistance that can be used to help with revenue loss. And throughout this crisis, they have continued to maintain a level of service. So if we go back to where this started in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on our budget, you may recall that for FY20, the year-end revenue challenge, sales was off almost $9 million, and all-in revenue was off about $14 million. We have controls in place and possible expenditure offset. So it is not our intention to draw on fund balance to close the books for FY20. But there is a rollover into FY21. At the annual strategy meeting, we were actually $17.5 million to the good in terms of our revenue projections, but the impact of COVID-19 has reduced that to just $1.5 million. As I mentioned last month, there are some ways for us to handle some of our issues for 2020, but also there are some things that we're doing in 2020 that we will roll over into FY 2021 to mitigate the impact of this loss of revenue. So let's talk about closing the gap. So if we go back to April 13th, we had projected expenditures of $752 million. The projected revenue with that decrease is $729 million. So our April gap was almost $23 million. We always base that on the retreat, and so we went back to January. So in between January and today, we had almost $3 million of additional technical expenditures that we had to make to fulfill contractual agreements. And so that added to our gap. But also, because some of our revenue are pass-through and formula-driven, there's an offset on the expenditures. So the plus and the minus basically got us back to where we started, but 21.8 million was the gap to solve. One of the things that we said early on is that we would not attempt to pass this on to the residents. So we don't have this on the screen to suggest that we have a 1.5 cents tax increase to close the gap. It's just not an option that we pursued. We decided that as a group, as a team, that we would use innovation, creativity, and efficiencies, and more importantly, work as a team to see how we could close the gap. And I would like to talk to you a little bit about how we closed it. So not only did we take raising taxes off the table, we also said that we would remain structurally balanced. So in other words, we would not go into operational reserves or one-time revenue for ongoing expenses, which makes this even more difficult. We also said that we would continue to provide core services, but maybe the most important item on this list is that we would protect existing employees, and that's just not protecting jobs, but protecting them as they perform their jobs. In other words, making sure that they have the proper PPE and they have the proper tools that they need to be effective in performing their jobs. So let's start off with some efficiencies that we identified in operations, 8.5 million. And I will tell you that a lot of that had to do with department heads doing a couple of things. It's not just the elimination of vacant positions, but the department heads were able to work more efficiently. In other words, it's not as if we're not taking on more responsibilities. We're absorbing it into our day-to-day operations. So there's something to be said about the innovation around being able to do more with the same number of people that you have. So I really want to say that I'm so thankful for the team. Folks were able to say before we would even consider not having a salary increase or laying off people, let's see how we can perform our services with the resources that we have. So that's $8.5 million. Another $11 million came in a different manner, and we decided to protect our core services, not really raise taxes, but we also wanted to relieve the stress on the general fund. So outside of aviation and CATS and water and stormwater, the bulk of our employees are funded through the general fund. So it was important for us to boost the general fund up as much as we possibly could. So some of these are just shifts in the way that we have allocated funds. So in other words, one of the first things that we did is that we shifted the allocation of sales tax from pay-go to the general fund. So there's one portion of sales tax that was formula-driven, and what we decided to do is split it a quarter of a cent to pay-go, a quarter of a cent to the general fund. And that change allowed to provide more than $5 million of relief to the general fund. We capture ABC revenue in the general fund. Typically, 75% of the revenue goes to the general fund, and 25% of that revenue goes to the debt service fund. We surveyed the largest cities in North Carolina, and the vast majority of them had 100% of the ABC revenue going to the general fund. So we are doing the same, and that's a 1.7 million. And then we used our capital capacity to transfer and expand street resurfacing. Typically, street resurfacing is done out of the general fund. What we're doing is moving it over into the capital fund as well as pay-go, and the end result is that we'll have $1 million more for street resurfacing, but we also have $4.3 million that can go to the general fund. So in this budget balancing exercise, you can see where we have the department adjustments, the shifting revenue to the general fund to protect operations. We talked about the street maintenance. Then lastly, we have $3.5 million in additional revenue that's related to solid waste. The increases in solid waste, what we pay the county to dump and some of the other fees that are charged the city came up to $3.5 million, and an 80 cents a month increase in solid waste covers that additional cost that we have. The reality is that doesn't cover what we have to do in terms of purchasing vehicles, so it's not even getting that to be a wash. But when we had all those, we basically had $1.3 million in additional resources, and we plugged those into management, investments in emergency management for obvious reasons. So let's see what this 2021 budget looks like. So the general fund is $718.8 million, which is a 1.2% decline from 2020. Our proposed positions in the general fund are down 20 from FY 2020. And in all funds, we net out to be down about 16 positions, all funds, from 2020 to 2021. The key is that the budget has remained structurally balanced. I think it's 4 years running that I've given you the slide, and that's a key slide that we want to always give you. We're not using any of the operating reserves to balance the 2021 budget. All in, this budget is about 3%, the $2.55 billion compared to $2.62 billion in FY20. This budget is about 3% less than the FY20 budget. So during this crisis, a financially resilient organization could do some things that other organizations cannot do. So it's important for us to keep the organization going. We have to make sure the residents feel safe, that water runs, traffic signals work, trash is collected. We do that so that we can create this environment where people want to live and where people can thrive. So I don't want to ever discount how important some of the things that we take for granted each day, like cutting on water or flushing. It happens because of the 8,000 plus employees that we have that have been working every day of the year to make sure the core services are provided. So we will have short, medium, and long-term recovery. Most of that is being discussed throughout the state, throughout the country. We have a team that's in place that's also discussing that. A lot of this will come from our council committees as well as the 3 council task force that are there. But for us, innovation in great neighborhoods and mobility, safe communities, workforce and business development will always continue. It may be that it's just in a different way, and our combination of resources will get us to a place where we will recover. I want to talk to you just a little bit about what has been going on the last 50-plus days. We don't really talk about this in terms of reopening because we never closed, and I just need to have a shout-out to the folks who have been working so hard. Here are some of the things that have occurred since March 26th. CMPD has responded to almost 28,000 calls for service. Solid Waste has picked up almost 20,000 tons of residential waste and almost 5,000 tons of recycling. CDOT cleaned 2,400 catch basins and filled 64 potholes. Charlotte Water completed almost 1,400 water and sewer work orders for repairs. Planning and CDOT approved 63 plats and plans and 139 land development permits. CATS continues to operate 70-plus buses a day, and Housing and Neighborhood Services has contacted 200 neighborhoods just to check in on them, to see how they're doing, because that's what we do. So again, we don't like to say that we're reopening, and we have a team together that's looking at this over several periods. One is that we're following the governor's order, and what does it mean as the county opens back up, what will be the demand for services from the city. But we also have a 6-month view, which is the last quarter of FY20 in the first quarter of FY21. I'm committed to coming back to you at the beginning of October to give you an update of where we are with revenue and expenditures. And of course, we will be coming back to you weekly. But in terms of, are there any changes in direction that we need, we'd like to have that discussion in early October as opposed to a typical January annual strategy meeting. So we also said as a priority is to protect our existing employees. As I mentioned, they continue to deliver exceptional services even in this crisis. So what we have done is we have safety as a priority, and we continue to strive to be an employer of choice. One of the things that we don't say enough is that we want to attract the best talent to work for the city of Charlotte, just like any Fortune 100 company does. And in order to do that, we have to create an environment where people want to be on this team. So everything starts with our employees. We are going to have a 3% merit increase for our salaried general employees and a 3% combined market and merit increase for our hourly employees. And that's important. And we've always looked at this as total compensation. So to have a salary increase and then just take it away with the increase in the insurance premium nets that out. So for the third consecutive year, we will not have an increase in our health insurance premiums, and the plans will stay very much the same. And we will continue our all-access transit pass. And I just believe that this $33 a year for our city employees to ride any form of public transit, when that would cost something close to $1,400 annually, it's just a great incentive to be a part of Team Charlotte. And our whole goal is to get more organizations to sign on to having this type of pass access. We're also going to complete the 2-year police pay plan. And for anybody who didn't think that Kerr Putney smiles, the guy in the picture is Kerr Putney. And I told him that I was going to do a product placement of him because I may not have a chance to do this next year. So it's how much we admire what our guys in public safety do. We wanted to make sure that we held firm with our commitment to them. So as you will recall, we have a public safety pay plan, and it's a 2-year plan for police and a 3-year plan for fire. This would get us to fully fund the 2-year plan for police and be 2/3 of the way for the plan for fire. And the key with the plan is to improve officer attraction, increase officer top pay, and for officers to reach top pay sooner. And we've also established a senior police program for police. In terms of fire, same concept. This is year 2 of a 3-year plan. We've reduced the number of years to reach top pay, and we've increased top pay for the firefighter 2, the fire engineer, and the fire captain. I think this is the most important slide with the pay plan. When we started off in 2018, top pay for a police officer was $72,580. Top pay now is over $86,000, which is a 19% increase. And you can see that for the police sergeant, the firefighter 2, the fire engineer, and the fire captain, how we have been very deliberate in making sure that these individuals can reach top pay sooner and the top pay increase. One thing that's very important is that we learned a lot from other recessions and other crises. And one of the things that we learned with police and fire was those years after 2008 where they went without step increases. This plan has now, for police, gotten every step back to 5%. And when we meet with the pay plan committee, we're all on board together. I know there's a next step after this, but it's good to make sure that we stay committed to this plan. And the results are great. When we look at the results, we see that police voluntary resignations are down, so is fire, and new recruit applications are up. So we believe we're doing something right, and there's nobody who can be a better can market police and fire better than police officers and firefighters. We're going to remain disciplined in FY 2021. Our core services will continue. But the delivery of these services will change, and expenditure plans may change based on actual revenue. As I mentioned earlier, it's very likely that we'll still be working through this COVID-19 related challenges well into 2021. That's why it's very important how we use any federal dollars to offset these costs. But it's also important that we come back to you in early fall to reassess where we are. So there's resilience also in our capital plan. So it's important as we start to think about why we're able to be in the position that we are in, both in operating capital. It's because we have spent years trying to make sure that we protected core services and that we could deliver these core services so that when a crisis comes, we're able to shoulder it much better than many. It's interesting, this past fall, one of the rating agencies rated the top, did a review of the 25 largest cities in the country about how resilient they were. And Charlotte was one of 6 that scored the highest. And you will see much of that over the course of the next weeks and months, how we respond to what's in front of us. So capital planning, we were able to, over the years, update our assumptions. We have developed a project planning program, and many of you, I think, would see me sweat through changes in some of our scopes and some of our projects, and we feel that we're in a good place now. And because of that, we believe that we can move forward with our capital plan. So we're continuing to invest throughout the city, and this is the last installment of our big ideas. If you will recall that there were 4 bond cycles, 2020, 2018, 2016, and 2014, that did a lot of great things throughout the city. There were CNIPs, there's affordable housing, there's support to enhance our street network, pedestrian, bicycle safety, and economic development strategies. When you put all of those together over the 4 bond cycles, it equaled $785 million over those 8 years. We just did not believe, we were in good shape because of financial stability to move forward with this $197 million of additional activity to complete the big ideas. As I mentioned earlier, because the council has been consistent with its priorities, we didn't have to shuffle too much of any of these bond cycles, even as we started to address them midway through. And it's good to be able to come to closure on it. As we evaluated our capital accounts, we realized that almost $37 million of funding we were able to adjust. So in other words, some of the projects were deferred because they weren't ready to go into any type of construction. Some of the projects may have been viable at one point but were no longer viable. So we would not hold capacity for projects that were no longer viable. But it allowed us to do more with some of the priorities, especially those that you have presented to us over the last 2 years. So investing in transportation and mobility. So we always had $15 million set aside for building and repairing sidewalks, and there's another $18 million set aside to construct the Bryant Farms Road. In the 2018 bond, there was $2 million for the planning of it, and now we are able to fund the construction of it. But as we were reassessing the CIP and that $37 million that I spoke of earlier, it also allowed us to fund some programs that were not originally contemplated in the 2020 bond. For example, this proposal that I have for you tonight will add $4 million to Charlotte's bike program, $2 million to Vision Zero, $1 million to implement ADA improvements, and then $7.6 million for congestion mitigation and traffic flow enhancements. And I would like to talk a little bit more about the congestion mitigation and traffic flow enhancements. As we go back and review those last 4 bond cycles, many times you would save up a good deal of money in order to build a road, and that would take years. And so what we've learned, what CDOT has learned, is that there's a great opportunity to do smaller projects which help with congestion mitigation and traffic flow. So the $7.6 million identified in the CIP, as well as $6.7 million that's available in PAYGO, gives us over $14 million to provide congestion mitigation in areas that need it most: the Steel Creek area, South Charlotte, and University City. So this is something that we're proud of, that we're able to address some of the traffic flow issues even before the next major road project is in the CIP. And it's important to make sustainable investments. As you know, this fiscal year was the first year of our Strategic Energy Action Plan, where we did a good deal of assessments. And what we found is that we could make investments both in our buildings, but also in charging stations and electric vehicles. So there's $3 million total, and $2 million will increase our building sustainability, and we're very excited about that, but even more excited about purchasing 20 electric vehicles. That's 20 electric vehicles, or more than the total electric vehicles that we have in our fleet. And those would be sedans, but we're also going to invest $1 million for charging infrastructure. So it's one of those cases where we've discussed that in order to electrify the fleet, one of the things that we had to do first is provide for charging infrastructure, and we will look for opportunities to also partner with the private sector there. We're keeping the momentum in affordable housing. This bond cycle, we have $50 million again for affordable housing. So that would be $100 million over 2 years. It took 16 years to get to the first $100 million. So it shows the commitment that this council has to address affordable housing. So we're excited that we have the capacity to have another $50 million bond, and just maybe there's somebody out there who may want to match that too. The proposed bond allocation, as I mentioned earlier, $197 million, $102 million for transportation. We mentioned the affordable housing. I want to talk a little bit about neighborhoods, because as we analyzed those projects, we created some additional capacity. So always in the CIP was $30 million to complete our Big Ideas CNIPs. So that would be the last installment there, but this will be the first time that we place $14.5 million to support corridor development. During the annual strategy meeting, the council spent a great deal of time discussing corridor development. As a matter of fact, I believe Tracy and Tai Wo talked about some key areas that we should have an emphasis on. So not only do we have $14.5 million in CIP, we have $10 million in PAYGO to also have new investments in our corridors. And that $10 million in PAYGO will cover areas such as business recruitment. It will cover areas such as placemaking. So we feel comfortable that this is a different way of addressing corridors, different than what we've done in the past. This is more collaborative. And what we've come to find is that everybody was doing good work, but they were doing it as a department and not necessarily as a team. So I'm excited that Tracy Dodson and Tai Wo and Liz Babson and Pam Whiteman are taking the lead on having a comprehensive view on the front end of how to have better outcomes in our corridors of opportunity, and that $25 million is our beginning. It's a tailored approach to not only build capacity, but also capitalize on the momentum. We call them playbooks. There are a couple of these neighborhoods that have strategies in place, and we believe that a good portion of these funds can be used to start to implement those strategies. As Councilmember Graham has often said, we've studied things a lot, and we're moving beyond studying to implementation. We're also levering partnerships for safer communities. In January, the week before our annual strategy meeting, we talked about this framework to address violence. So we're not moving away from that. So we're supporting the Violence Interrupter pilot. We're developing a violence crime dashboard. We're launching a fellowship program, and we will continue our Jumpstart microgrants to build grassroots capacity, but we want to lock in to these opportunity corridors for those grants. We continue to manage water resources. Stormwater, which with an operating budget of a little over $15 million, has no rate increase, and water with an operating budget of $172 million has a 1.9% rate increase. It's the lowest rate increase in more than 10 years. And we had this in mind with what's going on with the general public today. Our goal was to minimize rate increases as we get through this crisis. So as I wind it down, Mayor, members of council, I hope we've made the case that we have a stable organization, a resilient organization, but maybe more importantly, an adaptable organization. We preserve core services in this budget. We are not laying off employees. We do not have a tax increase. We preserve our long-term financial health by not using one-time revenues in the general fund. As we continue, we'll continue to update you, but what's most important here is just the team that we have. And normally at this time of the budget, I think the budget team, which I will, and Ryan Bergman has done an awesome job, and Kelly Flannery, our CFO, has done an awesome job too, and the budget team had to put together a budget book virtually. And I'll tell you that's probably one of the strangest things that has ever occurred, because typically it's a bunch of people running around, cutting, shredding papers and punching holes and all of that. So kudos to the budget team who's been able to put together what I think is an awesome budget, but also to the entire team, every department director, deputy director, assistant director, the folks who have been working from home, the folks who have been coming in every day. We can't do this without you, and we very much appreciate all that you do. And so we'll get through it. We'll get through it together. The next steps is the budget public hearing. It's May 11th. The adjustments are the 20th, and then the straw votes are the 27th, and the fiscal year begins July 1st. So, Mayor, members of council, I am turning this budget over to you. Together, we serve this resilient Charlotte, and it's a pleasure being your manager, and it's a pleasure having the team around me. So, Mayor and council, it's your budget.
All right. Thank you, City Manager. First of all, I want to say thanks. We have a great professional team that lives and serves our city, and that's a very important part of it. And I think the manager has represented them well tonight, but I want to thank every employee, all of our 8,000 employees, for participating in this budget process and understanding how difficult the times are and stepping up to resolve one, to serve the community without imposing additional tax burdens on them. The manager, you represent everything about our organization in this budget. So there are two key components that have been recognized. One, now the public has this budget, and we will have that public hearing on the 11th. We will often hear from advocates, but I encourage any citizen that has anything that they'd like to consider or have thought about to come forward in our budget public hearing and talk to us as a council and a community, talk to our team and express your concerns. And you don't have to have an answer for everything, but at least come and be heard. And then after that, the council gets the budget. It's online right now, and the budget book will be coming. So those that like to highlight everything, council, it's now our budget to take a look at, to study and examine, question, comment, and look at it in the context of our strategic planning efforts, as well as building what I think the manager recognizes as a resilient workforce. After our public hearing, we should be able to sit down and begin to talk about changes that we would suggest as a whole to the manager's recommended budget. So with that, I believe that we begin our study period, and we've got the budget to look forward to. Our straw votes are a few weeks out, so I encourage us to begin our conversations and collaborations, especially in our recovery task force groups, where it seems appropriate. And you're hearing from a lot of people already. So we are going to recover. Over the past week, I've been with several mayors across this country, Atlanta, Los Angeles, New York City, actually, but a number of cities more comparable to ours. And I have to say that they would admire the budget that was presented to us tonight because of the issues that they're having around a number of things that are around this pandemic. And so it's good to know that we're able to weather the storm and be all in this together. So with that, I'll take a motion for adjournment of this meeting. We have a motion and a second.
Second.
Do I have okay. Any further discussion?
Madam Mayor, I have two questions.
Who is that?
This is Donata. There's a question from Mr. Driggs and a question from Mr. Newton.
All right. Mr. Newton, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Donata. Thank you, Mr. Manager, for this budget presentation. I had two questions that I was hoping could be addressed. The first one is going back to the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the $154.5 million fund. I think we all recognize that there is tremendous need in our community. We're looking at a housing bubble that has been created and is going to continue to grow leading up to when the stay-at-home order is lifted. Also, a lot of need for small business in the community. And I know, Mr. Manager, that you had mentioned that I believe you focused a lot on operational expenses for that particular fund. You'd also mentioned that it could be available for public health expenses. I believe that's things like PPE, maybe hazard pay, overtime for city employees. I've read the U.S. Department of Treasury's guidance. So there was a document that they released back on April 22nd pertaining to this particular fund. And I was just hoping to get a little bit more clarification regarding the economic support portion of that. In that document from the Department of the Treasury, it specifically mentions that money could be used for grants to small business. It's also my understanding that money would need to be refunded if it's not used. It's a big pot there, and I'm just wondering, is all of that being taken into consideration? You had mentioned that we would be receiving recommendations on this in about 30 days. I personally don't know, given conversations I've had with numerous small business owners here in Charlotte, if they have that kind of time. And I'm wondering, has all of that been considered? Is that included in our budget here? What plans do we have thus far to make sure that we get that need out to the community? Well, assuming it's included, we get that need out to the community as soon as possible with that coronavirus relief fund. And then I had one more question after that.
So thank you, Mr. Newton. So you are correct. I put this into two buckets. One bucket is critical operations and infrastructure, and the other bucket is investments and economic support. So there's $155 million. The instructions have come out, and there is flexibility there. What I would suggest is we don't know exactly how much we would use of that for the critical operations and infrastructure versus how much should be used for investments and economic support. So the critical operations and infrastructure, it's anything from PPEs to costs associated with public safety that addresses the COVID-19. What we'd like to do is see what's happening with some of the other cities also. Could you do some type of relief fund for small business? Absolutely. Could we retrofit buses? Absolutely. And that's what we're trying to do, is give you an opportunity to be thoughtful about how to utilize these funds. One of the things that I believe is important is that we should leverage. If while we have to use these funds between the period of March 1st and December 30th, I would ask that you think about how could you leverage these funds to bring more funds to folks who are in need. So, yes, we did send that guidance out to you and all the council members. I think it was 5 o'clock on Friday. And I did say that tonight I would talk a bit about it, which I have. And we believe that it should be a thoughtful process. And I think, as the mayor mentioned earlier, having the task force reports back, I think, would be very helpful in how this council decides to use the funds.
I think
Now, I would-
if Mr. Newton, if I could just add to that, I do think that that is an important consideration for us going forward, and I particularly look to the work. We really I would like to say, Mr. Newton's the first question to the budget book, where we will write your question down, identify the council member that asked it, and give you a written reply versus the manager has gone through, I think, about 45 minutes of presentation, and he will give the opportunity for the entire organization to weigh in on those kinds of questions. But I think that question is really important for the Charlotte Recovery Task Force effort with the small businesses. So I know that's Ms. Ashmira, Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Isold, and Mr. Bakari, as well as 7 other citizens across our community that are weighing in on that. So look forward to that. So I'm going to go. You have another question, Mr. Newton, and then Mr. Driggs, and I'd like to limit it to questions that we. Can I say something? I think that our practice has been that we ask the questions that we would have to send those in to the manager, and then that way we would get a response that's written and shared with everyone. So we keep everyone with shared information and the ability to have shared decision making. So Mr. Newton has question number 1. If you'll state your question number 2, Mr. Newton.
I have 2, and I would agree with you, Mr. Manager. I mean, our scope for operational expenses is limited because it's only between March and December. But I do think that we need to operate with a sense of urgency here to make sure that as we appropriate money, that we're doing it before it's too late for some of the needs that we know exist in the community. The second question is this: so with the reserve fund, I'll have to wrap my head around the shifting around of some of the funds that we have here, and look into the budget more thoroughly. I know that we talked a lot about PAYGO funds being shifted, and there was talk about congestion mitigation and traffic flow enhancement, corridor investments that those funds are used for. But I just wonder, we're looking away from the reserve fund. It's at 16%. I know that the state's reserve fund is just below 6%, and their perfect bond rating is still intact. At what point in time would we look at that reserve fund to say, hey, maybe that is somewhere that we need to target to pay for operational expenses, and maybe not shift around so many funds that might be used elsewhere?
So I've given the budget that we presented tonight. I think I know it would be irresponsible to dip into the operational reserve when you have a structurally balanced budget. So there's not a recommendation I could give you to dip into that.
So that would be question number 2. I like to say that kind of question is a policy, a financial policy that impacts every part of our community, and that would be a council debate that if we decided to change that financial policy, because the 16% is something that's included in the foundation for our budget making, it has certainly been tested this time. So, Mr. Driggs, do you have a question? Mr. Driggs, I can't hear you.
Just want to quickly congratulate the manager and the staff for coming up with a budget that does not have a tax increase, maintains essential services, and is even aspirational in places. And otherwise, Madam Mayor, in the spirit of what you just said, I'll save my questions for later. Thank you very much.
Again, for the council, if you can get the budget and look through it and make sure that you get your questions to the manager, we'll be ahead of the game in terms of where we have common ground around questions and issues and things that we'd like to do. I think it's going to be a tough year for all of us, and we've still got to have our city protect our employees, remember those that are impacted most by this virus, and hope that we get to phase 1 with the governor's emergency declaration. We had a motion and a second for adjournment. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. Thank you to the team. I think that we really appreciate the wisdom and guidance that you've given us, and now it belongs to the community and this council. Thank you, everyone. Good night.